begin. So it's my great delight to introduce and also welcome back Professor Ponce Vázquez, because he's an alum of our very own PhD program in history. He is now Associate Professor of History at the University of Alabama, a specialist in colonial Latin America, and in particular, his research focuses on the Spanish Caribbean world during the 17th century. Today, he's going to talk about his wonderful book, Islanders and Empires, Smuggling and Political Defiance in Hispaniola, 1580 to 1690, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, during the height of COVID, when he couldn't do in-person talks, I'm assuming, though he is featured in several wonderful podcasts that you can find on his webpage. I have learned so much from this deeply researched and beautifully written book, and it deservedly won the 2021 Alfred B. Thomas Award given by the Southwestern Council of Latin American Studies. He has a number of new projects underway, including a book titled Afro-Descendants in the Spanish Caribbean Borderlands, 1580 to 1680, that will center the experiences of enslaved and free people of African descent in the Spanish Caribbean. And so with no further ado, let me present our speaker.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here, even if you have to be. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. Thank you to Dr. Marcy Norton for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be back at Penn. It's been a long time. I graduated at 2011, so it's been a while. And also Dr. Catherine Barch for the logistics. I really appreciate your help. Thank you. This presentation, as Dr. Norton actually mentioned, is based on my book from 2020. In the book, I try to understand the peoples of Hispaniola and their deep, intimate, and persistent embrace of smuggling through the 17th century, and I situate their story at the crossroads of the fields of colonial Latin America, the Caribbean, and Atlantic history. So, it's a beautiful map of Hispaniola and a little bit of Puerto Rico right in the corner too. And the book goes, historians love to play with dates. We love, we don't have enough with actually doing 16th or 17th century, but when you talk about the long 16th century, the long 17th century. So this book is about the long 17th century, understood from 1580 to 1690 approximately, right? So, I'm sure you guys are familiar with the term Atlantic world. The Atlantic world can be understood in many different ways. One particular way in which I think about it, it is as a growing network of interconnected European colonial port towns and cities, as well as their hinterlands. These regions developed simultaneously to the integration of those port cities into their own English, Dutch, French, and Spanish imperial systems. At the same time, illicit cross-imperial relations became a crucial element in the rise and development of these portuary enclaves, especially when their own imperial networks served them poorly, right? Particularly places like Hispaniola, that as we go into the 17th century, in the last decades of the 16th century, it was progressively marginalized in the kind of the formal commercial networks of the Spanish Empire. So, and Hispaniola became kind of the focus of this book in part because I was really interested about how little people talk about Hispaniola in general. People didn't, in the historiography, kind of never talked about it, right? So from the perspective of Latin American history, and those who are actually doing colonial Latin American history will actually be familiar with this. If you look at your textbook, probably you hear about Hispaniola until more or less 1520 or 15 teens, and then it disappears, maybe to make an appearance later on in the turn of the 18th to 19th century, but it kind of, it disappears from everywhere, from every narrative, right? In books on Caribbean history, if you actually look textbooks of Caribbean history, you realize that actually it's basically, most of the Spanish Caribbean appears very little. It's almost like it's not important to the narrative at all, right? And similar happens, in a very similar way it happens in books about Atlantic history, in which the Spanish Caribbean becomes kind of like passive recipients of actual European aggression. They're just sitting there and people are attacking them, right? And they just kind of like sitting ducks in the middle of the Caribbean, right? With nothing to do apparently. They're not doing anything at all. So that caught my eye, right? I thought this cannot be it. This cannot be all of it, right? So that was, and this is another Dutch image of Santo Domingo, highly idealized, but it's still eerily accurate in some ways. So with this, this is what it pushed me to write this book. The book in itself, like the thesis of the book, I'm gonna give it to you straight. The thesis of the book, I argue in the book that the inhabitants of the Spanish colony of Hispaniola overcame their peripheral status within the Spanish Empire by embracing the possibilities that the people, networks, and goods that this burgeoning Atlantic world provided for them, right? To basically becoming an active participant of this kind of new, nascent Atlantic economy, right? Elites wove themselves into the fabric of the illicit trade and dominated it as they could. Other residents from all walks of life also made their lives to the trade. And by carefully navigating around Spanish imperial monopolistic expectations, or simply by ignoring them, Hispaniola's residents turned the island into an Atlantic center in their own right. They pursue their short-term and intermediate social and economic goals, while also embracing cross-imperial contraband as an economically viable and this is important, morally acceptable livelihood for their own personal prosperity. In the process, steeped in the contraband networks that ruled the colony, Hispaniola residents transformed the political dynamics that ruled their relationship with the Spanish monarchy, giving themselves great control over the decision-making institutions on the island, as well as important parts of the Spanish Caribbean. And this idea about the morality of smuggling is something that intrigued me. And right as I was researching my book, another book came out by Dr. Jesse Cromwell. He wrote about the moral economy of smuggling, which I thought was really interesting. And that kind of really, it's funny, I was working kind of on the same vein. So I kind of like, with Dr. Cromwell's work became actually really important for mine too, thinking about the moral economy of smuggling, in which he describes, right? He describes it as the social ethos that cuts across race and class, unifying the great majority of society into a communal pact that normalizes the practice of and benefits from contraband trade, while maintaining a deeply hierarchical society in which enslaved and free people of color, either willingly or forcibly, participated in the trade, often as cogs within a smuggling machinery controlled by white elites. So now the thing is that Dr. Cromwell's book actually is from the 18th century Venezuela. So I'm working on late 16th and 17th century Hispaniola, and I'm seeing the same things, which makes me think that actually this idea about smuggling and this morality is something that Spanish colonists and Spanish residents in the Spanish Caribbean have been dealing with for a long time, at least since the 16th century, right? So Islandstone Empire details the efforts of local residents at every social level, those enslaved on plantations and in towns, free town residents, and especially the social and political machinations of the elite, who manipulated and benefited most from this illicit trade. It considers actions of the Spanish crown, often ineffectual, sometimes really brutal. The considerations also of the Catholic Church, how the Catholic Church was thinking about smuggling, the dynamics of local rivalries, and the impact of non-Spanish networks and residents on the island, a factor that only continued to grow throughout the 17th century. So, the first part of the book, the first chapter, I'm trying to kind of provide like an introduction to actually for people who don't know anything about Hispaniola, and I go all the way back to Columbus, right? I try to kind of I talk a little bit about the people who were there before Columbus, of course, and the world that Columbus encountered, and the world that Columbus in many ways created, Columbus and the people who came with him created, right? So we talked about I talk about the Columbus Wars against the Taínos, right, in the 1490s and early 1500s, about the gold economy that appears on the island and in the 1520s, fueled precisely by indigenous labor and later African labor, who's going to be brought massively from Africa by Portuguese traders to really work on this gold deposits. Then how gold basically kind of disappears and it runs out basically, and they need to figure out something else to do, and that's going to be, that thing to do is going to be sugar, right? Sugar is going to be, Hispaniola is going to become the first plantation in the hemisphere, right? The first plantation economy in the hemisphere. And with all the things that brings, right? Massive importation of enslaved labor from Africa, raids from all over the Caribbean to bring indigenous people to work in these plantations, a lot of indigenous and African resistance that is going to happen, that is going to play a crucial role during these years. And this is going to basically continue until the 1560s and 70s, in which the sugar economy starts declining for reasons both internal and external, right? Brazil at this point is starting to produce a lot of sugar also. So there are all these factors in the Atlantic, but also internal, that is going to make sugar start slowly to kind of like, lose importance. It's never going to disappear. And there are going to be all the alternatives that appear, like indigo, for example, which is going to be very important in the second half of the 16th century, but nothing like a boom economy like there was before, right? So it is in chapter 2 that I start talking about, well, if sugar is kind of on its way out, what came in? And one of the things that comes in is contraband. Contraband becomes more and more important, like an engine of people's of the local economy. So from 1580s to the turn of the century, contraband had become an intrinsic part of Hispaniola's culture, and that of many other parts of the Spanish Caribbean. Many island residents organized their lives around the trade with foreign merchants. They created an alternative marketplace, a parallel system to the one sponsored by the Spanish crown. A marketplace that people from all corners of society, including members of the royal administration and the clergy, participated in and benefited from, either knowingly or inadvertently. Some people didn't know that they were actually buying contraband goods, and they were super scandalized when they actually found out. It's really funny when you read about it. Or at least pretended that they didn't know. That's another point. The easy and cheap access to European commodities prolonged the sense of prosperity and comfort in the day-to-day lives of the island's inhabitants and made the hardships of living in a progressively isolated territory more tolerable. So you may wonder, what are they trading, right? What are the things that they're getting? Enslaved people was one of them, for sure. Enslaved Africans was one of the things that was actually being traded. But probably more important than that, or the bigger number of things that actually were traded, were actually cloth, like clothing, cloth, clothing, hats, accessories of all sorts to make clothing. Clothing is going to become really, really important. It's really important anywhere in the early modern societies, right? In the Caribbean, it becomes really important because clothing becomes one of the ways to actually kind of like express, kind of like differentiate rank in society. And the Caribbean is really hard on clothing, right? It disintegrates the clothing. So there is a constant need to actually present yourself in public in a way that is according to your rank. So there is a constant desire to actually acquire clothing that actually signifies and symbolizes that rank. At the same time that the weather is disintegrating your clothes. So clothes are going to become a really important element in the economy and all over the Caribbean to maintain this kind of hierarchical image, right? So, and this is basically what Hispaniola looked like. These are the main towns of Hispaniola in the late 16th century. Right? There were more when actually, in the first years of the 16th century, mostly next to where the gold deposits were, but many of those towns kind of disappeared and people left them because when the gold went away, these mining towns disappeared, and those are the ones who actually survived the second half of the 16th century. And here you have, this is kind of like the image that I used in the cover. This is actually, this is the Jaina River, which is west of Santo Domingo. And you can see some ships. It's upside down. That's actually the way the thing is. That's the way the painting is. And you can see the ships on the coast. They're possibly actually engaged in some sort of contraband. Another thing that is happening at this time, and at the same time that contraband is becoming really important, there are some people on the island who are concerned about what are the consequences of this contraband, right? So you need to remember that this is 1570s, 1580s, 1590s. We are at the heart of the Counter-Reformation, right? So the anxiety about spreading certain ideas, right, that are considered illicit, that are considered actually dangerous ideas from Protestants, is going to be really in the forefront of the mind of a lot of people in Hispaniola, those who are maybe not participating in contraband or are concerned about the effects of contraband on the island, right? So there are, for example, members of the clergy who feared the consequences that close relationship with foreign Protestants traders might have for the economic and spiritual life of the local residents. These concerned observers made no distinction between French, English, and Dutch merchants. They were all seen as a threat to the economy of the island and the faith of its inhabitants. And the language that they use is obviously, it's always kind of medical, right? It's like there's a fear of contagion, right? That, that these ideas are going to kind of like spread like a disease through the social fabric of Hispaniola. And it's going to actually make people basically to abandon the true faith. So they're talking really kind of like, it seems exaggerated, and this is the problem sometimes that we, I think a lot of historians don't take, historically in the past, they think that it's exaggeration, right? They think that actually this is just kind of like a blown up language or rhetoric. We are kind of like entering the Baroque, So this is kind of like, this is a blown up rhetoric that it really doesn't express how people are feeling, but the reality of it is actually that that's exactly what they're feeling, right? They really think that basically the fabric of society is going to break down and the crown is going to lose these possessions, because once they become Protestant, it's going to happen the same that is happening in the Netherlands right at this time, right? That it's a province that belongs to the king by inheritance and it's gone, right? Because of Protestantism. So this is a concern that people are writing constantly about to the crown during this time. There is the contagion is real, and we're going to lose this colony for His Majesty, we're going to lose these territories for His Majesty, we need to do something about this. Another thing that actually is important at this time, 1580s, 1590s, early 1600s, there was a complete inability of Spanish royal bureaucracy to actually attack and eliminate illicit trading. Local judges rarely managed to catch smugglers and make an example of them. Special prosecutors sent from Spain encountered increasing resistance and a hostile environment to carrying out their mission in Hispaniola. Even when they managed to capture and convince smugglers, the convictions were often ignored. So there were convictions that were actually accused of a crime, and there was actually a penalty, and nobody actually carried out the penalty. All attempts by the crown to curb the contraband trade failed, and by the early 17th century, Hispaniola was firmly established as one of the most important contraband centers in the Caribbean. There is a local judge who he was doing basically an inspection of the interior of the island, and apparently some smugglers attacked him, like physically attacked him. And he tells the story of how he escaped only with his shirt. That's all he actually managed to escape. He runs away. And he tells the king, in his letter to the king, he says, the only thing that we can do about these people, he talks very pejoratively about the people in the north of the island. He says, the only thing we can do with these people is do the same thing that we did with the Moriscos in Spain, right? In Granada, with the Moriscos in Granada. That's a reference precisely to the expulsion of the Moriscos in Granada in the second half of the 16th century as a result of the second Morisco rebellion in Granada, right? In which basically all the Moriscos that still lived in Granada are going to be spread over the entire Iberian Peninsula to precisely kind of like to try to counter kind of like their influence and to basically kind of like in many ways also destroy kind of their culture, right? And try to kind of make them assimilate into Spanish culture. So there is a judge in Hispaniola who's actually using these words and saying, we need to get these people out of there. That's the only thing that we can do to eliminate contraband. And ironically, that's exactly what the crown is going to do. That's exactly what the crown is going to do. In 1605, a plan is put in place to actually kick out of Hispaniola everybody who lives beyond that imaginary line that you see drawn west of Santiago. So the people of Bahia are going to be kicked out. The people of San Juan de la Maguana, the people from La Yaguana, Puerto Plata, all these towns are going to be gone. They're going to basically burn them and destroy them. And people are going to be forced to actually go to live to two newly founded towns, which are, you see them in white, Monte Plata and Bayaguara. You can see how their names are a combination of the former city names. You know, they kind of created cities basically in places where there was none before, and moved the people from Monte Plata is basically Puerto Plata and Montecristi, right? And Baya and La Yaguana are going to be moving to Bayaguana. So these towns are going to be actually where these people in theory are going to actually move in, and everybody who crosses the line is going to be put to death in the spot. There's going to be a local rebellion. This is basically most of chapter 3. This is the entire I kind of go through the entire history of the populations and try to kind of like show the dynamics, the internal dynamics, right? There are people who are trying to sabotage the populations. There are people who are actively resistant. At some point, the Dutch are going to give weapons to some of the northern residents, and the northern residents are going to resist the Spanish forces. So there's a true drama happening, right? People are seeing how their houses are being torched, right? So this is not a small thing. So it becomes a really powerful moment, a really destructive moment that people are not going to forget easily. In fact, in many ways, this is a moment that later in the 20th century is going to still be used by Trujillo's dictatorship as a kind of like a turning point. You know, so the propaganda under Trujillo is going to use this moment of the population to kind of like as part of their own national imaginary, right? And we can talk more about that later if you guys want to. So the book, you know, it's about smuggling, but the other part of the book that I really wanted to talk about is actually how these people actually, in the long run, actually, because here it seems that actually they've lost, right? Smugglers have lost. They have been kicked out of the towns, and they're moved to these new towns close to Santo Domingo so they can be watched, they can be observed. Now no longer roaming through the interior, or through the kind of like the faraway shores, right, Hispaniola, to do whatever they want, no longer. Well, the reality is actually throughout the 17th century, something is going to happen in Santo Domingo in which many of these people who actually were living actually in the outskirts, and others who already live in Santo Domingo and were also smugglers, are going to start actually gaining a lot of power, and a tremendous amount of power. So, and to understand how they were able to wield that much power, we need to talk about this building and the people who actually lived in it. Now, most Spanish port towns in the Caribbean, they had a governor. It was quite common to have a governor at the time. And Santo Domingo in that is not unique. They also have a governor, and the governor actually lived in this building. It's called Casas Reales today, and it was called Casas Reales back then. It's basically the house of the king, right? It's the royal houses, right? So the governor, as the representative of the king, resides in this building. But there is another institution that is actually unique to Santo Domingo, and that is the Audiencia. The Audiencia, I don't know if you guys have actually talked about this in class. So audiencias are buildings there are institutions that the Spanish crown is going to create all over their possessions, right? And these are courts of appeal. Imagine it's almost like it's like a state Supreme Court of sorts, right? It's basically there is a body of judges, like 4 or 5 judges, right? There is an attorney for the king who actually kind of pleads the case of the crown, right? And there is this body of judges who are going to be in charge of basically all the cases that actually are happening in the Caribbean that people are appealing, right? Because somebody might not be happy with the rendering that the local judge in your town actually kind of does of a case that you have with them, so they can appeal it. And when they appeal it, they actually come here to the Audiencia. So the Audiencia of Santo Domingo is going to have a jurisdiction that basically goes through East Puerto Rico, part of Cuba, all the island of Hispaniola, and it's going to change over time. At some point, parts of the coast of Central America were also kind of like part of his purview, of his territory, and also another important part is going to be Venezuela. So Venezuela, the entire of the coast of Venezuela and part of the interior, it also falls under the jurisdiction of the Audiencia of Santo Domingo, right? So this is kind of like the irony of Santo Domingo this time is that at the same time that it's becoming more peripheral from an economic perspective, because merchants are not stopping anymore, because they are charging double or triple for their products, because they're not interested in stopping. The Caribbean is becoming very dangerous to navigate The only way to navigate the Caribbean is actually normally with a big fleet, right? So going to Santo Domingo is very risky. So most merchants don't want to go there, and Santo Domingo is becoming more and more marginal in this kind of like formal commercial networks, right? At the same time, however, it's going to preserve the importance of a place in which his judges have a say about basically all the cases that are being litigated all over the Caribbean at this point, right? So this dichotomy, right? This double situation is going to be very important to understand why certain individuals in Santo Domingo are going to gain a lot of power, and it's the proximity to this institution, right? So throughout the 17th century, Hispaniola elites, and particularly Santo Domingo elites, accumulated influence and wealth as smugglers, and also the money and the wealth they accumulated as smugglers permitted them to exert increasingly tight control over the reins of all local institutions, especially but not exclusively in Santo Domingo. This local control not only allowed them to practice their illicit dealings without being prosecuted or punished for their actions, but gave them an outsized influence in the Audiencia of Santo Domingo. Local leverage over the machinery of power within the Audiencia allowed them to establish mutually beneficial connections with other renowned Caribbean smuggling regions such as Venezuela and Nueva Granada, which is current Colombia. They did this with almost complete impunity while using the royal treasury to finance their illicit dealings. So how did they do this, right? How they actually become so powerful they control what was happening in many of these buildings. So what they did, many of their earnings that they made actually with smugglers, they started buying local offices. And this is a common practice across the Spanish Empire around this time. The crown is short of cash, perennially short of cash, and it needs cash to make war in the Netherlands, among other things, to stop the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. The Spanish crown is always entangled in numerous conflicts all over the place, right? So in order to be able to pay for those things, the crown's going to start selling local offices in city halls, for example. All the people, like council members in city halls, they start selling those positions all over the Americas, right? Scribes and notaries, this is another position that actually is going to become for sale. And many, many others, bailiffs, constables. People are going to be able to buy those positions and then also pass them to their children. They can be inherited with a fee because the crown needs to keep getting paid. But they could actually inherit it. The children could inherit those positions. So you can have a person who buys that position in 1600, 1610. You can see their children still serving the same position in 1680, right? So these offices are becoming patrimonialized into certain families, right? And that allows these people who are now sitting in City Hall in a city of Santo Domingo, every time there are some religious ceremonies, every time that there are certain events, they are showing up to these events as a City Hall, as a cabildo, it's called, right? And they go all together, representing their institution. And who's there also? The members of the Audiencia. And they're rubbing shoulders with each other. And they're doing all kinds of ceremonies. They're doing all kinds of interactions with each other, protocolary or otherwise. So they are rubbing shoulders constantly. Another thing that is happening is that the Audiencia Santo Domingo, the judges who come from the Audiencia Santo Domingo normally come straight from Spain, because the Audiencia Santo Domingo, of all the audiencias in the Americas, is the lowest ranked one. Which means that in the cursus honorum, basically, on the career of a judge in the Americas, normally their first destination is Santo Domingo, right? From there, they could move, for example, to Guatemala or Santa Fe, right? And if they continue to be actually promoted, hopefully at some point in their careers, 20, 30 years later, they will be able to end up their careers in Mexico or Lima, right? But their first destination is this one. They are not only very green, very, very green in many cases, but they are also very, very in debt for having had to pay for the passage to come to Santo Domingo out of their own pocket. They've had to borrow a lot of money. They're bringing their families, their dependents, their servants, and that costs money. So they are in debt. They don't have nowhere to live. You see, and here comes the local people say, well, I have a house that I can lend you. Do you need money? How much do you need? So you can see how these bonds are starting to be created, right? These relationships of dependency, right, between one another. And this is how basically kind of networks operate in Santo Domingo, right? People doing favors for others and creating these networks. So these judges end up actually becoming part of these local networks, basically, right? And they depend on them for their own survival in many cases. On the other hand, people like the governor also is going to fall into these networks. And as local people increase their influence into these institutions, they're able to handle them in many ways, right? So there is another element that becomes really important to understand port cities in the Caribbean, and that is the situado. We need to talk about the situado just for a second. I'm going to write it down. Situado. You see, most of these port towns, they don't produce enough money to pay for their own administration. They are deficitary, right? So the money has to come from somewhere. And you might be thinking, well, so why is the Spanish Empire maintaining these places that actually they produce no money? What kind of colony is this if it produces no money? Well, the problem is that they cannot just pack and go, right? Because if they do that, what's going to happen? The English are going to come, the French are going to come, the Dutch are going to come, right? And they're going to, and the Caribbean is really dangerous because you are right on the path of the silver from Mexico, right? From Veracruz. So the Caribbean needs to be protected and needs to remain in Spanish hands so it doesn't fall in the hands of other nations or other kingdoms, right? Who can then, from there, attack Spanish possessions and take the silver that is coming from Veracruz, right? So you need to maintain these possessions. You need to have them at all cost. So you send money. You send money to maintain them. And you send money in the form that the money that you send is a situado, right? A situado, every year, an amount of silver will be actually sent to each of these port towns, right? The only one of the islands, of the Caribbean islands, probably the only town that doesn't actually receive a situado at this point is probably Havana. Because Havana makes a lot of money because it's actually a port where the Spanish fleets kind of go through it. So it makes a lot of money on its own. But any other town that you think of, Santiago, San Juan, Santo Domingo, all of them receive situados. The situados is a bunch of silver that basically comes on a ship. And it comes from Veracruz, most cases. In other cases, it comes from Panama, from the silver that comes from all the way from the Andes, or from Cartagena also. So depending on the time, the situado comes from a different place. But this money, basically, imagine, right, once a year, there is this enormous amount of silver that actually arrives to these ports. And local people are watching, right, and saying, well, if we can get our hands on this. And they did. They actually managed to get their hands on it. Precisely by cultivating the relationships with people of the audiencia, what they did is that, see, it's not that the king sends the situado. Somebody has to go to pick it up, right? So the governor has to appoint somebody who has to pick it up. And who's going to appoint? Who are they going to appoint? Well, a local person, of course, who is going to fleet a ship and is going to go to Cartagena or to Veracruz, right? And get a bunch of silver. And what he does between the point of actually getting the silver and getting back home, a lot of things can happen during that time, right? And they're going to buy a lot of contraband goods. Sometimes, and in most cases, with the governor's knowledge of this, right? And many governors were the first ones to initiate this system. So local people are going to become really good at really kind of trading with the king's money, basically. They are making money out of the king's gold and silver in this case, right? So from all these people who are doing this, and they're going to become really good at it, and they're doing it all the time throughout the 17th century, there is one guy in particular that I was able to kind of track down. So from all the residents in the island of Hispaniola, no one managed to take advantage of the island institutions better than a guy called Rodrigo Pimentel, who one judge of the audiencia referred to as the prime mover of all machinations. And let me show you, this is another image of Santo Domingo here. And you can see, it's Santo Domingo under attack. And it's an interesting image because the streets have disappeared. And all you see are the important buildings, like convents, churches, monasteries, and fortifications. Those are the only buildings that you actually see. It's a wonderful image. But I wanted to talk about Rodrigo Pimentel. This is Rodrigo Pimentel. I'll talk about this in a second. This is actually a plaque that Rodrigo Pimentel put himself in the convent of Santa Clara in Santo Domingo. If you go to the convent of Santa Clara in Santo Domingo today, most of the convent is gone, but the church is still there. A little part of the cloister, and like half of the cloister is there. And if you go to the church, you will see that there is close to the front of the church, there is this plaque there that he put there himself, because he paid money, he gave a lot of money to the convent to restore the convent at some point. He spent a lot of money on local institutions. He became like a patron for a lot of institutions on the island. And he actually wrote himself, he wrote in the, right on top, you can see there's an inscription in Latin, which I didn't know what it meant. I was trying to figure it out. I had to ask a colleague who was a classicist to actually help me out with this one. Apparently, it says in really poor Latin, in really bad Latin, it says, "Fear the day of the judge." Fear the day of the judge, which obviously it seems to be a clear reference to actually Judgment Day, right? To kind of like fear the time that you die, because then, right, you're going to have to kind of pay for your things. But I love this sentence, because in many ways, Rodrigo Pimentel, if something, he's the guy who never feared a judge, right? He's the guy who always defied every judge that he encountered and got away with it, right? So Rodrigo Pimentel, when he was still alive, a graffiti reading in the walls of the Audiencia. Remember the building that I showed you earlier, the Audiencia building? So one night, a graffiti appeared on the walls of the Audiencia, and it said, "There is no other law or king than Don Rodrigo Pimentel," it said. In Spanish, it would be, "No hay más ley ni más rey que Don Rodrigo Pimentel." It has a little more of a rhyme. During his long political career that went from 1630 to his death in early 1680s, Pimentel held at times an unparalleled control of most, if not all, corporate bodies of Santo Domingo, including the city's cabildo. He was a regidor, he was a councilman in the cabildo. His brother was too, and he bought the position for many of his allies too, right? So he controlled the cabildo, the secular church also, because his brother was actually the dean of the church, which is the second in charge after the archbishop. So every time that archbishop died, his brother was in charge of the church. Part of the regular church, so Franciscans, Dominicans, Mercedarians, they all basically owe allegiance to him and defended him often. And the Audiencia as well. He also had lots of friends within the Audiencia, with the walls of the Audiencia. So in one of the chapters, I talk about his public life, right? All the things that we know about him through the documents, right? He rose over his peers in wealth and influence to become a master manipulator of local institutions, as well as the head of a renowned smuggling operation with contacts across the Caribbean. Rodrigo Pimentel was the most powerful local man in Santo Domingo during the 17th century, even arguably the most powerful man in the history of Hispaniola during the entire colonial period. A man who by the end of his life managed to accumulate a personal fortune calculated of more than 300,000 pesos. He also, his actions benefited his relatives and allies through his ability to sway governors, ministers of the Audiencia, and local elites across the Caribbean in mutually beneficial partnerships that earned him copious amounts of wealth and influence over the institutions and people of the island. So I was able to basically, because this guy got into so much legal trouble throughout his life, and he got into a lot of trouble. There are entire bundles of documents dedicated to actually his trials. So you can go through them, and many other correspondence that is scattered all over the archives. And you can actually kind of like reconstruct his life almost, right? So that's what I tried to do. At some point, he was actually imprisoned and sent to Spain to actually pay for all his crimes. Fortunately for him, the Spanish crown was always willing to accept a lump sum in cash to forgive almost anything. So that's exactly what he did. He paid basically his way out of trouble, and he went back to Hispaniola, and then he sought basically vengeance on everybody who had betrayed him. So it made things really, really pleasant for everybody who he disliked. And from here, after talking about Pimentel and kind of all the things that he did, which is kind of like a fascinating story, it's kind of like the most fun chapter that I think that I wrote. Then the last chapter of the book is about the relationship of Hispaniola with the French. which are going to become very important. As you remember, the French settlers consolidated their position in the western lands of Hispaniola in the second half of the 17th century. The place of the island within the geopolitical struggles of the Spanish and the French crowns were forever altered. So as you remember the populations that I talked earlier, right? You remember all the people getting out, being pushed out of the western area of the island. Well, 20 years later, 30 years later, other Europeans started settling on that part of the island, right? Everybody's heard about Tortuga, the island of Tortuga, of course, a famous of pirate lore. Well, the island of Tortuga is actually off the coast of Hispaniola, right in the northwest part of Hispaniola. So it became a pirate center, a pirate cove, right? And slowly but surely, France managed to establish control and authority over the western side of the island. It was disputed between the English and the French for a while, and finally the French established control over it. And that is going to become really important for the history of the Spanish Caribbean, for the history of the Caribbean in general, but also for the history of the island in particular, right? The Spanish residents of the island had to protect their territory and property from French encroachment. There was a constant kind of like a strong tension between both sides. But at the same time, they found in the presence of these new neighbors opportunities to trade and to a certain degree prosper in ways that it had been impossible for nearly a century. Throughout this period, and we're talking about approximately 1670s to 1690s and beyond, my book stops in 1690, but this relationship continues throughout the 18th century. The Spanish crown never gave up the hope of expelling the French from Western Hispaniola and placing the entire island under his control once again. In order to carry out these plans, however, the crown needed the collaboration of royal officials on the ground and local residents. So you have a situation in which the crown sees that they have lost control of the western part of the island, and they are trying to recover it in some ways. At the same time, local people see in a very different way. There is tension, sometimes there is conflict, there is war between both sides, there are skirmishes, there are attacks to local towns, but there is also trade. There's also commerce. At the same time, the people are attacking each other, they're also trading with each other. And this is going to be the beginning of a very important relationship between both sides of the island, right? One of the things that the Spanish side of the island sort of be really great at is actually in cattle ranching. Cattle ranching is going to become the most important economic activity in the eastern side of the island throughout the colonial period. And in the 1680s and 1690s, what you have on the west side is actually like basically a growing plantation economy with increasing numbers of enslaved Africans who are being brought in and that they need to be fed. And as you move on through the 17th century, what you have is like the rise of Saint-Domingue, right? As this really, probably the wealthiest and most important colony in the Caribbean for the French and for everybody else. It's the wealthiest colony who's being basically fed with cattle made on the eastern side. So the ranching in the eastern side is going to become the way in which Saint-Domingue is able to rise so high from a plantation economy perspective, right? That system of exploitation was only possible because the food source was right there across the border, right? So that relationship is born in this moment, 1680s, 1690s, 1670s. That is the moment in which these two parts of the island establish this relationship. So Spain is trying to kick them out, and there are going to be two attempts to actually kick out the French in 1690 and 1691, I seem to remember. And the one in 1690 was a success. The Spanish actually sacked many French cities, and they could have kicked them out. They were like local troops on the ground, and then Spanish ships, a Spanish fleet attacking from the sea. And they were able to basically destroy many of the cities, but when it came time to actually finish the job, local people decided just to turn around and go home. They didn't want to turn, they sacked, and they were happy to actually plunder, but they didn't want to keep going. They got their treasure, they got their loot, and they wanted to go back home. They wanted to continue fighting. There was another attempt the year after, right, in 1691, to put together another expedition to do another attack. And even before they attacked by land, local people just walked away. They walked away from the conflict because they realized that the divisions of the spoils. They didn't like the divisions of the spoils. They didn't like the captain who was in charge of the expedition. They didn't like a lot of these things. And they decided that it was better for them just to walk away. At that point, the relationship between both sides had become quite important. And the trade was only growing during this period. Only a few years later, in 1697, and this is actually what the island looked like in the 1680s and 90s. You can see Spanish side on the side, and then you can see a couple of Spanish towns that are being founded in the border as an attempt to claim territory in the border, right? To claim part of that territory. And then you can see all these different settlements on the western side in many of the cities that still exist today, of course. Some of them with a slightly different name, but they actually still exist today. And that shaded region in the center, that line region in the center, is actually the one that is kind of like always in constant dispute, right? So let me conclude. Let me finish up. Islands of empire demonstrate that spaces that are traditionally imagined as marginal to the history of the Caribbean, colonial Latin America, or the Atlantic world, once properly contextualized, provide a lens to understand the imperial systems in ways that places considered central to imperial ambitions can't. They provide you a different perspective. If you look at things always from like rich, wealthy centers, you can only see it in a certain light. You need to go to the frontier sometimes, to the borderlands, to other places to and look in instead of actually staying in the center and look out. I think that's something that historians are progressively learn, that you need to move to the sidelines and kind of look inward sometimes to see something different. Hispaniola provides a framework for understanding the enduring yet conflicted relationship of Spanish imperial borderlands with Madrid, particularly in the Caribbean region. Since the island was far from a priority for crown bureaucrats, elites on the island enjoyed a great margin of maneuver within their social and political environment. Ironically, that independence of these elites became an important binding element in the relationship of Hispaniola as a peripheral colony with its imperial core. Santo Domingo's patronage networks successfully appended the system of colonial governance. Governors and members of the audiencia, despite representing the king's authority, became defenders of local interests as well as their own. Despite some efforts by the crown to restore his control over these institutions through strongly worded decrees and visiting judges, colonial institutions remain under the unequivocal influence of local residents who shaped them and continue to exert considerable authority over their daily functions. With their letters to Madrid, local groups fought to discredit the local rivals while presenting themselves as the king's most loyal servants. At times, their letters succeeded in shaping royal responses. On other occasions, the Council of the Indies, already overburdened by endless correspondence from the Spanish colonies, appear to have been paralyzed by these discordant versions of the reality on the ground. And amidst all the noise that these conflicting narratives created, it seems as if royal ministers chose to ignore them to focus on more pressing matters. Against the backdrop of the fierce imperial competition that we have come to expect in the early modern Caribbean between European kingdoms, Hispaniola appears as a fluid space in which inter-imperial collaboration on the ground was often understood not only as reasonable, but quite possibly inevitable and perhaps even as moral. Recent arrivals from Spain often complained in their correspondence about their disloyal behavior of locals and other officials who had become accustomed to such practices. Spanish Caribbean residents, however, knew that it was in their best interest to find opportunities to maximize each other's resources, even if that meant to cross the invisible lines that separated imperial worlds. At times, they appear to have seen these lines as highly porous, while at others, they treated them as fictions that they could and had to ignore to ensure their own fortunes. At the end of the day, smuggling may have been an illicit practice, but it contributed to the survival and prosperity of Hispaniola and other Caribbean colonies, the same regions that kept the imperial dreams of European kings alive. Thank you. And we have a little time for some questions, if you guys... Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions. Thank you for your presentation. It was fantastic.
Thank you.
I have one very connected with my own research
Mhm.
and interest. It is what happened with the University of Santo Domingo. It's the first university in the Spanish
Mhm.
Americas.
Yeah.
And when you were mentioning this decline of
Yeah.
Hispaniola,
Yeah.
I would like to know more about, maybe it was marginalized
Yeah.
in economic terms, but maybe not in intellectual terms, and I would like to know more about that. That's the first question.
Yeah.
The second it is, you mentioned how in this moral economy of smuggling, there were people that in certain way was scandalized when they discovered
Mhm.
that they were participating in that. And my question is, how you would describe these networks of participating in this moral economy of smuggling? Who were connected in those networks? Because I'm thinking, as you mentioned, there is this author who is also seeing the same phenomenon in Venezuela in the 18th century, and I'm thinking also in cases in New Granada, when the Viceroy and Archbishop Cabello de Góngora is bringing flour from the United States
Yeah.
to the New Kingdom of Granada, using exactly the same resources
Yeah.
of the king. So my question is this phenomenon of smuggling and contraband something that is very extended in the Caribbean? Is something very American-like? Is very something connected with the colonial practices of moving trade? What do you think? It is more, or is something that is connected with marginalized space and semi-peripheral spaces? What would make this smuggling more arise in places not only as Hispaniola, but also in New Granada, in Venezuela, and others? What would make it more connected?
All right, thank you. So regarding the university is going to stay there. The university was housed in the monastery of Santo Domingo during this time, and the university continues to be there throughout this period. It's normally used by local people to actually kind of receive an education, kind of the children of the elite in the island. Sometimes people from neighboring islands, probably Puerto Rico, would actually go to the University of Santo Domingo, which at the time I think it was called University of Santo Tomas, I think it was, and there was these priests or friars actually were the ones who were normally in charge of the education. They were the professors in it. It basically lived through this period. It was still there. I think with the founding probably of other universities in other places, probably it lost a little bit of its luster. I think, but it continued to be there as a functioning institution throughout the 17th century. That never changed. Now, regarding your second question about the morality or kind of like the conflicting views about different people thinking whether or not smuggling is moral or immoral, right? I find both in the documentation, right? I mean, in the archives you can see both. You can see individuals who are, or at least pretend to be, highly scandalized about such practices. People who basically, I have examples of people who when they realized they were buying smuggled goods, they actually went to their confessors to ask if it was okay, because the priests are in many ways a moral authority. Then you have another priest, some confessors telling to the people who are confessing, don't worry because this is okay, this is totally fine. There's an expression I cannot remember right now. It says something about your needs don't. This is an expression they use is fantastic, and I kind of put. He said your needs know no morality or something like that. So basically, a way to express that actually, what you need is this. There's nothing wrong about getting what you need, right? So they even found ways to articulate, right, why this is a morally acceptable behavior, right? Were they fully honest about this, or were they also immersed into this kind of contraband networks and were actually financially benefited from it? Are they mutually exclusive, right? Can you benefit from it financially and also see it as a good? I think it's all of the above, really. And I don't think there is kind of like, I think all of those possibilities exist. People who understood it as a risk to their soul, actually to engage in contraband goods, to buy contraband goods. There were people who completely saw it as morally justified, particularly when you went to the port of Santo Domingo and you go look at the merchants and you see what they're selling. You see what they're selling, or you're buying in the black market, and you see that this costs 3 times more, and it's the same thing, right? How do you justify that, right? Or you have this production, you have been making ginger, or you have sugar, and you want to send it to Spain to sell it, right? And you go to a merchant, and the merchant tells you, a Spanish merchant, and he tells you, if you want to send this to Spain, for every box of sugar that you have to send, you have to give me 1. Right? Or you can go to the French ship in the north of Hispaniola who will buy it, and they will give you like the equivalent in clothes, an exorbitant amount. So, I mean, the system is created in a way that people are going to actually find moral justification in actually doing this. Not everybody, but many of them do. Right? Remind me of your last question, I'm sorry.
Do you think this behavior is very specific
Oh,
to
yes.
the Spanish Empire?
Yeah.
Is very specific
Oh, no.
to the Caribbean area? Is very specific with colonial dynamics of extraction and colonies? What do you think? How would be this comparable with other cases in that respect?
Oh, I mean, I think, smuggling, just like piracy, is just kind of universal, right? I mean, piracy is kind of associated normally with the Caribbean, but the Caribbean was not the first place to have pirates, right? The Mediterranean, the Northern Sea, the Indian Ocean, there have been pirates everywhere. Smuggling is no different, right? I think smuggling is a reaction to certain state practices, right, that restrict the free circulation of goods in some way or another, right? And in a way that actually works against the interest of the consumers, right? So in that sense, when there is a need and people want something, I think there is something that we have learned, right? If people want something, they will find a way to get it, whether it's legal or not, right? And that's what we see here. That's part of what we see here.
We are out of time, but you might be available to answer some questions.
Happy to.
If you want to come forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you.